They buried 157 coffins, and not one of them held a body. That sentence was never meant to be heard. It was whispered behind closed doors, locked in sealed records, and buried in the frozen soil of Pennsylvania coal country. But now, you're hearing it, which means it's already too late to forget it. In the winter of 1879, under gray skies and the silence of snow, a group of state investigators pried open the first coffin behind St. Stephen's Church. Inside wasn't a corpse, it was stone. Cold, heavy stone, carefully arranged to mimic the weight of a man. They opened a second, then a third, then 97 more. Not one human body, just silence and stones. 12 years, 157 funerals, every record immaculate, every sermon poetic, every widow paid in full, and every grave a lie. What happened in Millbrook, Pennsylvania was not an accident. It was a system, built by men who wore collars and spoke of salvation. It was not about faith. It was about control, psychological, spiritual, economic. And it worked because no one questioned death. No one questioned grief. And no one dared question God, but you will. Because the truth behind those empty coffins doesn't begin with burials. It begins with a man, Reverend Marcus Thompson. A man whose sermons could silence a crowd, whose eyes saw through pain, and whose hands were never clean. Behind the pulpit, he offered comfort. Behind closed doors, he offered something else. An escape, a transaction, a sentence. This wasn't just insurance fraud. It wasn't just a church gone rogue. This was something more ancient. A method hidden inside morality. A machine powered by despair and justified by theology. And once you see how it works, you'll start to notice ... it never stopped. Graves at St. Stephen's were empty, but the system that built them is very much alive. If you're still here, good. You're not just watching a story, you're stepping into forbidden history. The kind of truth that once heard cannot be unheard. Keep listening. And whatever you do, don't look away when we open the next coffin. St. Stephen's Church stood like a sentinel over Millbrook, plain brick. Modest steeple and stained glass windows that filtered in just enough light to feel holy, but never quite enough to feel safe. The building was ordinary. What happened inside was not. When Reverend Marcus Thompson arrived in 1867, Millbrook was drowning. The coal industry had transformed it into a machine for breaking men. Cave-ins were common, explosions were routine, black lung was expected. Death was part of the economy. Thompson didn't preach fire and brimstone. He offered relief. He spoke of peace, of dignity in death, of God's plan for even the most broken families. And he gave them something no one else had, a way to prepare. His church-sponsored life insurance program was revolutionary. 50 cents a month, $500 upon death. No questions, no paperwork. Just sign here, worship there, and when death comes, your family is safe. At first, it was a blessing. Then the bodies stopped appearing. They were still dying, of course, or so everyone thought. But slowly, the deaths began to follow a pattern. Men with terminal illnesses, workers crippled in accidents. Those nearing the end, their funerals were fast, the coffins always sealed, the cause of death always neat. But the sorrow that was real, wives wept, children clung to Thompson's robes. And when the payout arrived in days, not weeks, the gratitude silenced suspicion. Because who would question a miracle when they were starving? This is how control begins, not with chains, but with kindness. The predator cloaks himself in compassion. And in a place like Millbrook, where hope was currency, Reverend Thompson was the wealthiest man alive. Behind him stood two others, Dr. Cornelius Whitman, the town's physician, and Samuel Crow, the undertaker with hands that never shook. Together, they formed a trinity, spiritual, medical, and funerary. And they didn't just handle death, they orchestrated it. They created a machine that converted men into memory. Bodies disappeared. Coffins closed. Claims paid. And no one asked where the dead had gone, because no one wanted to believe the churchyard was a lie. This wasn't malpractice. It wasn't a loophole. It was a system. Precise, ritualized, profitable, and invisible to anyone who trusted God more than their own eyes. And that's how they got away with it. For 12 years. His name was James Morrison. A miner, a father of 3, a quiet man, who rarely spoke unless he had to. In January of 1868, Morrison walked into Dr. Whitman's office coughing blood. His lungs were blackening. The diagnosis was a death sentence. He had maybe 2 months. There was no medicine, no miracle. It's just time. Slipping through his fingers like the coal dust in his palms. He could die gasping in his bed, or he could listen to what Whitman had to say. "Your body is finished," the doctor whispered. "Your death can serve a purpose." Whitman leaned closer, lowered his voice like a man delivering scripture. "You sign this? We declare you dead officially. Your wife receives the insurance, enough to feed and clothe your children for years. And you go away. Quietly. You work the mines out west, where names don't matter." Morrison stared at the paper.
This wasn't an offer.
It was a crossroad. He chose his family. The funeral was held 3 days later. Reverend Thompson's voice trembled with divine grace as he described Morrison's courage, his faith, his eternal reward. The coffin was closed early, a precaution. They said, black lung made the body fragile, unfit for viewing. His widow wept into Thompson's chest. The insurance check arrived in less than a week. James Morrison, woke up chained inside a wooden rail car rolling into the darkness beneath Centralia. He had no name now, just a number scrawled in chalk across his back. He was no longer a man, he was inventory. A warm body to be burned in a machine. This is where the lie deepens. Because they didn't send Morrison to rest, they sent him to disappear. He worked 14-hour shifts in collapsing tunnels, ate bread that tasted like metal, slept in damp quarters beside other dead men, each one buried alive by Reverend Thompson's gospel. They'd all made the same choice, die with dignity or live as ghosts. And that is the genius of psychological control, when the victim calls it salvation. Morrison lasted 5 months. He collapsed under a load of slate. No priest spoke his name. No wife claimed his body. It was shoveled into the earth like waste. The world mourned him once. But his real death was invisible, because it was never supposed to be seen. What began with James Morrison became doctrine. Reverend Thompson saw something in that first transaction, something divine, he claimed. A holy exchange. One soul's suffering buying another soul's salvation. It was, in his own words, Christ-like. A theology of sacrifice repurposed into a ledger, and he knew exactly how to scale it. The next man was Samuel Price, a railroad worker with a crushed hip and no future. Then Edward Vaughn, stricken with tuberculosis. Then Peter Rice, caught beneath a mine beam, but still breathing. 12 men vanished in 2 years. 12 sealed coffins. 12 grieving. Families paid in full, no questions, just tears and silence. Behind the pulpit, Thompson spoke of resurrection, of God's mysterious will, of men who served even in death. He preached not to inform, but to numb. Every Sunday sermon was a lullaby, sung to keep the sheep asleep. But behind closed doors, things grew colder, smarter. Whitman and Crow refined the process like engineers. Whitman implemented mandatory health exams for all policyholders. Preventative care, he called it. But in reality, it was screening, cataloging the sick, the dying, the desperate. Crow developed new coffin techniques, hidden hinges, reinforced false bottoms, weighted sacks that matched body mass. He even learned how to mimic rot, but family insisted. On a viewing, he could stage just enough decay to dissuade further inspection. It was no longer a ministry, it was an industry. By 1870, they'd moved 37 men through the system. Each death followed the same blueprint: diagnosis, consultation, consent, disappearance. And every man thought he was choosing dignity, thought he was escaping poverty, not falling into something worse. Because what they weren't told is what waited on the other end. They were sold to mine operators who paid by the head. No names, no histories, just labor. No wages, just food, chains, and silence. They worked until collapse, then were discarded. They didn't just vanish from their families. They vanished from history, and the church profited from every soul. This is the sickness that grows in institutions when no one asks questions. When authority wears a smile and whispers, "This is for your good." Thompson didn't see sin in what he was doing. He saw structure, order, divine efficiency. And as long as the graves stayed full, the coffins stayed closed. No one would ever know the truth. Her name was Eleanor Dawes, 33 years old, a coal miner's wife, 2 children, strong spine, quiet eyes. The kind of woman people underestimated, and rarely twice. Her husband, Henry Dawes, had been diagnosed with early-stage emphysema. Nothing urgent, but enough to raise flags during his routine church health screening. Within weeks, he was dead. Sudden cardiac arrest, said Dr. Whitman. A closed casket funeral followed. Swift, efficient. Reverend Thompson delivered the eulogy like poetry. A life completed, he said. A sacrifice honored. The payout came in days. But Eleanor never cashed the check because something was wrong. Henry's boots were missing. His wedding band was gone. She had packed both in the casket herself. She remembered she'd placed the boots beside his feet, slid the ring onto his cold finger. But when the coffin arrived at the church, it was already sealed. Crow told her it was due to rapid decomposition. But Eleanor wasn't grieving like the others. She wasn't numb. She was watching, and what she saw didn't sit right. For weeks after the funeral, Eleanor swore she saw Henry not in dreams, not in memory, but walking. A silhouette at the edge of the quarry, a figure behind the general store. Once she found his handwriting in the dirt behind their house, their son's name scrawled in the coal dust. She asked questions. People grew quiet. She spoke to Thompson. He offered scripture. She spoke to Whitman. He offered sedatives. She spoke to Crow. He offered silence. So she went looking. At night, Eleanor began tailing the wagons that left the church grounds. Funeral wagons supposedly carrying bodies to the burial site. But they didn't always go to the cemetery. One cold night in February, she followed a cart north, not to the graves, but to a railway junction. She watched from behind a snowbank as Crow unloaded a crate. Not a crate. No markings, no prayers, just a man's groan from inside. That was when Eleanor knew. Henry wasn't dead. He was taken. That night, she didn't sleep. Burned the insurance check. She removed her children from church programs. And she wrote a letter not to the diocese, not to the sheriff, but to an old friend in Harrisburg, ... a journalist. Because Eleanor Dawes wasn't just mourning. She was preparing to start a war. Eleanor's letter arrived in Harrisburg in early spring, addressed to Jonathan Hale, a young but relentless reporter for the Commonwealth Ledger. She didn't give him much, just a name, a town, and one line that burned like oil. There are empty graves in Millbrook, and the men they buried are still bleeding somewhere else. It was enough. Helly arrived in Millbrook under the pretense of covering coal union negotiations. But he wasn't here for labor stories. He wanted names, records, proof. He met with Eleanor in secret. In the woods, at night, she brought scraps, pieces of Henry's handwriting, sightings from neighbors, too afraid to speak publicly, and the names of 12 widows who had received insurance payouts without ever seeing their husbands' bodies. And then she brought him to the cemetery. One grave, Henry's. Together, they dug. 3 feet down, they struck wood. Hale's hands trembled as he pried open the coffin. Inside wasn't a body. It was straw, weighted sacks, a pair of stones, tucked beneath the lining, a child's toy horse. Henry's son had placed it with him before burial. The only real thing in that box. The next morning, Hale tried to send his story to Harrisburg. The telegraph office refused. Broken line, they claimed. The clerk avoided eye contact. That night, Hale's hotel room was ransacked, his notes gone, his bag slashed, and Eleanor. Gone, taken from her home, no witnesses, no struggle. Just her children left sleeping in their beds. The church offered prayers. The sheriff offered nothing. But the message was clear. We see you. We hear you. Stop. What Eleanor didn't know, what even Hal couldn't have guessed, was how deep the web stretched. Thompson was no lone conspirator. He was the tip of a structure that fed upward into diocesan leadership, local insurance, brokers, even county officials, each one wetting their hands in the river of disappearing men. And now that web was tightening. But truth is a fire. Once lit, it spreads. The grave was photographed, the straw collected, and Hale, now marked, committed himself fully. He would publish what Eleanor started, or die trying. Because something ancient had reawakened in Millbrook. Something sacred, inverted, and it wasn't just burying bodies, it was burying voices. Millbrook changed. Not slowly, violently, as if the town had been holding its breath for years. Now it finally exhaled poison.
The church bell no
longer rang for sermons. It rang for surveillance. Each morning, parishioners gathered not to worship, but to whisper. Lists began circulating, names of dissenters, outsiders, heretics. Eleanor's children were pulled from school. Jonathan Hale's room was torched. Sheriff Cully never investigated, because he wasn't supposed to. He was on the church's board of trustees. Hole escaped the fire, but not without scars, burns along his ribs. And the realization that this wasn't just about insurance fraud or missing men. It was about belief. A belief so old, so rooted, that even murder looked like mercy in its shadow. Hal met with the last person brave enough to speak. Agnes Vole, the oldest surviving member of the congregation. 93, half-blind, but sharp. She told him what no one else would. This town was never Christian, she whispered. She spoke of the Hollow Rite, a pre-Christian ritual that had survived. In the valleys of Pennsylvania, buried beneath scripture, masked by psalms, a belief that the soul must be emptied, drained through pain, sacrifice, and suffering, before it could become a vessel for the greater voice. And the empty coffins? They weren't mistakes, they were symbols. Offered not to death, but to something else. The men aren't dead, she said. They're being used. Used for what? Hale asked. She only said 2 words. The chamber. What chamber? Where Agnes said it lay beneath the church. Older than the foundation. Older than the town. Built before the first settler arrived. A place of echoes. A place of return. 2 days later, Agnes Vole was found in her home, her throat slit, but no blood at the scene. On the wall, a message. Painted in black soil. Tell no more. This was no longer a story. This was a war for reality itself, where institutions played the role of shepherds, but led their flock not to salvation, but into silence, and still Hale wasn't done. Eleanor's name hadn't vanished. It appeared on a ledger, a list of donors to the right. She was next. And he knew, to find her, he'd have to go where no outsider ever had, beneath the church. The entrance wasn't in the crypt. It was beneath the pulpit. Hidden under a warped oak plank, sealed with rusted iron and the mark of 3 interlocked. Circles, the same symbol etched onto the backs of the empty coffins. Jonathan Hale pried it open at midnight using a crowbar stolen from the sheriff's own shed. Below, a spiral staircase of stone, slick with condensation. No light, only the faint, rhythmic thump of something that sounded almost biological. Heartbeat, drum, He descended, the air grew heavy, the smell not just mold but rot and salted flesh. Along the walls, carvings, not in English, not in Latin, circular, repetitive, almost musical. And then he reached it. The chamber. Cavernous. Natural, but altered. Bones set into the walls like mosaic tiles. Candles burned in skulls. And in the center, a stone table, stained, worn. He wasn't alone. 8 figures stood in silence around the slab, cloaked in linen soaked with oil, faces obscured. But one voice greeted him. Mr. Hale, it said, calm and cold. You are not the first to come here seeking truth. But truth is a blade, and you are holding it by the wrong end. It was Reverend Thompson. Alive, calm, smiling. He explained nothing and everything. The rite was not corruption, it was preservation. A pact made long before the church was built, before settlers claimed the land. Every generation, a few were chosen, not killed, transformed. Offered up not as sacrifices, but vessels. For what he called the continuity. The body fails. Said, but memory does not. We do not bury the dead. We recycle the soul. The men. Stored, subsumed, their identities stripped, voices blended into a collective echo that guided the faithful. And Eleanor. She heard them, Thompson said. She resisted. We're correcting that. Behind the altar, a door of blackened steel, locked. And Hale had no key. He was grabbed, dragged toward the slab, but he fought harder than they expected. One candle fell, then another. The oil caught. Flames tore through the linen, screams not human, not individual, choral. He ran up the stairs, through the sanctuary, out into the night, but he didn't run away. He ran to his camera, to the photographs, to the recordings, to the last. Hoped that anyone would believe him, because now he understood the coffins were not empty, they were full of voices. And Millbrook didn't want them silenced, they wanted them spread. Jonathan Hale submitted his report to every outlet he could find, regional newspapers, national investigators, digital leak sites. He uploaded footage, photographs, voice memos, even a recorded interview with Agnes Vole, just days before her death. And he waited. For something, anything, but silence answered him. Worse than silence, removal. The websites that hosted his findings. Taken down. The editors who replied. All gave identical rejections word for word. We thank you for your submission, but this material is unverifiable and not in line with our editorial focus. A journalist at the Philadelphia Observer, who initially seemed eager, vanished mid-correspondence. Her name was later stripped from the site's staff page. Her LinkedIn deleted. Email defunct. Gone. Hale's apartment was ransacked. His external drives shattered, his photographs. Missing, his name began appearing on job boards under a different tag. Do not hire unstable. One night, returning from a failed meeting with a whistleblower, Hale found a letter taped to his door, handwritten, short. You are not fighting a town. You are fighting the infrastructure of forgetting who's being erased. Not killed, discredited. Because exposure is only dangerous when people believe you. And belief, he now understood, had been engineered. From the county coroner to the state licensing board. From the church archives to the press rooms. The continuity was not just a relic of Millbrook. It was interstate, an institutional sacrament, a network of silent towns, each playing a part. Each offering a fraction of the truth and burying the rest in sacred soil. Rural Pennsylvania was just one mouth of a hydra. The names changed: Millbrook, Red Hollow, Gethsemane, Whisper Creek, but the rite remained the same: empty coffins, no questions, no noise. He traced one lead to a shipping manifest. Funeral home in Ohio had ordered 17 ceremonial caskets from Millbrook, but no death certificates were filed. In Tennessee, Restoration Chapel bore the exact same tricircle insignia as the church in Millbrook, etched beneath a crucifix. And in Arizona, a journalist named Maeve Kettering had once written about disappearing men in closed coffin services. Before she disappeared too, it was never about one church. It was a system of churches, a system of chambers, a system of forgetting. And now Hale understood the final step of the rite. It was not just to sacrifice the body, it was to annihilate the memory so no story could ever become scripture. But he had one name left, Eleanor, and he knew where she was. She had become the voice. The asylum had no name, just a designation. Facility for 1A, buried outside of state jurisdiction. No signposts, no staff names, no visitors allowed. But hell. Found it through a shipping invoice. One of the ceremonial caskets had been rerouted here after a processing delay. What kind of coffin needs processing? A forged entry under a false ID dressed as a trauma counselor. No one looked. Twice. Inside, the walls were gray stone, just like beneath the church. Sterile silence, no radio, no natural light. Only the sound of humming, and it wasn't from the lights. It was coming from room B17, there seated in a restraint chair. Her eyes open but entirely unfocused, was Eleanor Vole. She was alive. But the woman was gone. Her mouth moved, not in speech, but in rhythm. Her vocal cords humming in perfect sync with the low droning tones Hale had recorded in the chamber. As he stepped closer, she whispered it. Not his name, but her own, but a phrase. We are continuity. We are recursion. We're the church without end. She looked directly into his eyes for the first and last time and said, "You brought them with you." Hale turned. The door behind him was open, and in the hallway stood Reverend Thompson. No guards, no staff, no alarm. Just a man, smiling as if this was all routine, because it was. "You were never meant to escape," he said. "You were meant to deliver." Hale had become a carrier, a transmitter. The rite didn't need books. It didn't need broadcasts. It needed witnesses, people who thought they had uncovered the truth, people who would spread it. Eleanor's body convulsed. Humming deepened, vibrating the walls. Lights flickered. Hale's vision blurred, not from fear, but from something internal. A pressure, a rewriting. Thompson raised a hand in farewell. "You've done beautifully, Mr. Hale. You've ensured that we will be remembered." Then darkness, when Hale woke. He was back in his car, parked outside the church, camera gone, notes burned. Days had passed. He tried to scream. No sound. Tried to write, but the words came out wrong. Not sentences, symbols, the circles. He was not Jonathan Hale anymore. He was another vessel. Like the 157 before him, like the hundreds more to come, and a cross. The country, in towns with churches that no longer keep graveyards, they've already begun digging the next empty coffins. Because now, you have heard it too. The continuity remembers.